The moment my brother smiled at me from across that courtroom, I knew he thought it was over. He leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something, then looked back at me like I was already defeated. "She doesn't deserve a dime," he told the judge. "She barely showed up." Some relatives looked away. I tried to speak. His lawyer interrupted. Then the judge paused on a single page and said, "What is this on page 9? The room went completely still. "My name is Delaney Brooks. I'm 34 years old and I work as a hospital administrator in a mid-sized city where I've lived for the past 9 years. My job isn't glamorous. I manage schedules, coordinate between departments, handle complaints, and make sure the right people are in the right places at the right time. Most days, nobody notices when I do my job well. They only notice when something goes wrong. That's a feeling I've known my entire life. I grew up in a house where being responsible meant being invisible. My younger brother, Tyler, was the one my parents talked about at dinner parties. He had charm. He knew how to walk into a room and make people smile. I was the one who made sure the bills got sorted, the appointments were remembered, and the house didn't fall apart. My parents weren't cruel people. They just had a habit of seeing what sparkled and overlooking what held everything together. My birthdays were often forgotten. Not every year, but enough times that I stopped expecting much. When I graduated at the top of my class, my mother said, "That's great, honey," and then spent the next 20 minutes on the phone with Tyler about his new internship. I don't say this to make them sound like monsters. They weren't. But there's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from doing everything right and still not being seen. I lived inside that loneliness for years. When my father got sick, Tyler was living 3 states away. He visited twice in 8 months. He sent cards. He called on holidays. But I was the one who took the days off work to drive Dad to chemotherapy. I was the one who learned how to manage his medications. I sat beside his hospital bed during the nights he was scared and couldn't sleep. I reorganized my entire life around his care because I loved him and because nobody else was going to do it. Tyler would show up and spend an afternoon, and Dad's face would light up. I understood that. I didn't resent it, at least not in the way that made me bitter. What I wanted wasn't praise. I never needed a trophy or a speech. I just wanted someone to notice that I was there, that I had always been there. That staying, showing up quietly and consistently was its own kind of love. After Dad passed, I had to grieve and keep functioning at the same time. That's what people like me do. We grieve in the margins between responsibilities, between the things that still need to get done. I wasn't rich. I wasn't glamorous. I hadn't built an empire or traveled to exciting places. But I had something they never expected. I had patience, and I had kept records of everything. I need you to understand something before I go any further. This isn't just my story. I know that because of the messages I get, the comments people leave, the friends who call me and say, I know exactly what you mean. If you've ever been the one who stayed quiet while others took credit, I see you. If you've been the person who handled the hard parts while someone else got the applause, I see you. If you've sat in a room full of your own family and felt like a stranger, I see you. These stories are not rare. Subtle family betrayal doesn't always look like screaming fights and dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it looks like being left off a group chat. Sometimes it looks like finding out decisions were made without you. Sometimes it's a smirk across a courtroom from someone who was supposed to be your brother. The quiet versions hurt just as much, sometimes more, because they're harder to explain to people who haven't lived them. If these kinds of stories feel close to home for you, I want you to consider subscribing to this channel. You are not alone here. There are thousands of people who have sat where you're sitting, feeling what you're feeling, and wondering if they were crazy for caring so much. You're not crazy. You just had higher expectations of the people who were supposed to love you. Have you ever been treated like you didn't matter until something finally proved otherwise? Leave that in the comments. I read them. And if this story resonates with you, click like or hit hype if that's your thing. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them most. My father died on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was holding his hand. Tyler had flown in the night before and left early that morning to take a call. I don't know what the call was about. I never asked. I was too tired and too sad to be angry in that moment. The inheritance came as a surprise, at least the amount did. $600,000 split between me and Tyler, but not equally. My father had left 60% to me and 40% to Tyler. I found out at the reading of the will with the rest of the family present. I sat quietly and tried not to react. I didn't want to make it about money. I was still grieving. I still am, honestly. Tyler's expression shifted the moment those numbers were read. The warmth drained out of his face. He didn't say anything in that room, but I watched his jaw tighten and I knew. I knew before he left that day that this wasn't over. 3 days later, a lawyer called me. Not my lawyer, Tyler's lawyer. He informed me that my brother intended to contest the will on the grounds of undue influence. The claim was that I had manipulated my father during his illness to change the distribution. I had to sit down when I heard that. I actually had to sit down because my legs stopped working properly for a moment. The family gathering that followed was tense in a way that felt rehearsed, like Tyler had already laid groundwork. Relatives who had barely spoken to me during Dad's illness were suddenly questioning my intentions. An aunt pulled me aside and said, "I just think it's strange. Your father always seemed very fair." A cousin told me, "Tyler said you were always pushing to be in the room during important conversations." I felt like I was watching a version of my life that had been rewritten without my knowledge. Tyler looked at me at one point and said, "You just got lucky being there at the end." I stared at him. I thought about every 4 a.m. medication alarm, every hour in a hospital waiting room, every conversation I had with nurses and doctors while he was 3 states away. I didn't say any of that. I just looked at him and nodded. Some things aren't worth saying out loud. Not yet. The legal process began in a way that felt surreal. Personal history dragged into formal documents. Private moments turned into exhibits. The years I had spent being steady and quiet were now being framed as suspicious. I understood what was really happening. Tyler wasn't just trying to take the money. He was trying to erase the record of who had actually shown up. If he won, the story would officially become that I had manipulated a sick man and that he, the charming and distant son, had been wronged. That was the part I couldn't accept. Not the money, the erasure. The weeks that followed were some of the most exhausting of my life. Tyler's version of events spread through the family like water through cracks. He was careful about it. He never said anything outright cruel. He just planted doubt. He framed everything as concern. "I just want to make sure Dad wasn't pressured," he told people. "I just want the truth." The word truth in his mouth made me want to scream. People I had known my whole life started pulling back. Cousins who used to text me went quiet. An uncle who had spoken at my father's funeral stopped returning my calls. I received a message from my mother's oldest friend that said, "I hope this all gets sorted out." It was polite. It was also a wall. I understood what it meant. I stopped explaining myself. That was the first shift. I had spent years explaining myself to people who had already decided what they thought, and I was done. I went quiet in a way that wasn't defeat. It was conservation. I was saving my energy for somewhere it would actually matter. Tyler also made sure I couldn't access the family home. He changed the security code without telling me, claiming he was handling estate management. Personal items that I had expected to collect, photographs, a piece of jewelry my father had promised me, small things were suddenly unavailable. He said documents were being organized. When I asked about a specific folder of papers I knew existed, he said he wasn't sure where it was. I knew he was lying. I also knew that what he didn't realize was that I had already made copies of everything important, months before any of this started. Then came the moment that confirmed every instinct I had. His legal team submitted a package of evidence that included old text messages between me and my father, taken completely out of context. One message where I had written, "Dad, you need to think carefully about who is actually going to be here for you," was framed as manipulation. Another where I asked him about his wishes for the house was presented as pressure. I read through those submissions and felt cold all over. Not just because they were dishonest, but because of how much effort had gone into assembling them. Tyler had been building this case for a long time. This was not a grief reaction. This was a plan. That realization changed something in me. I stopped feeling like a grieving daughter defending herself. I started thinking like someone who had a case to make and the evidence to make it. I had always known, somewhere in the back of my mind, that things might come to this. I had hoped they wouldn't, but I had prepared. What they didn't know was that I had kept everything. I'm not someone who does things dramatically. I'm organized the same way I'm always been. Medical visit logs, medication schedules written in my handwriting with dates, correspondence with doctors and social workers, voice recordings from conversations where my father, clearly in his own mind, talked about what he wanted and why. I had all of it. I had it because I was there, because I was always there. There was one document in particular, something my father had insisted on creating about 6 months before he passed. I had helped him coordinate it, but the words were entirely his. His handwriting, his signature, witnessed and notarized. I knew what was in it. I hadn't told anyone, not even my own lawyer at first. I kept it because I understood that some things are more powerful when they arrive at exactly the right moment. Page 9. I knew what was on it. I had read it so many times I could have recited it, but I had never described it out loud to anyone except the one person I trusted completely. I had a plan they never saw coming, and for the first time in my life, the quiet and careful way I had always lived was going to matter in the most public way possible. There was one person who knew almost everything. His name was Gerald Osei, and he had been a family lawyer for years before my brother quietly edged him out in favor of a newer, more aggressive firm shortly after our father's diagnosis. I had always liked Gerald. He was steady and precise, and he didn't perform. He just worked. I reached out to him a few weeks after the contest was filed. He agreed to meet me without hesitation. When I sat across from him at his desk, he looked at me for a long moment and then said, "I was wondering when you'd call." He told me he had met with my father multiple times in the last year of his life. Private meetings. He told me my father had been very clear about his decisions and had asked Gerald to ensure certain things were properly handled. He said the will was cleaner and more intentional than Tyler's team understood. And then he leaned forward and said, "There's something embedded in that document that most people would have overlooked." He didn't tell me exactly what to do. He just helped me understand what we already had. We built a defense that was clean and calm. No dramatic accusations, no emotional outbursts, just documentation, timeline, and truth. We organized everything in order. Caregiver logs, medical records, correspondence, witness statements from nurses, and a social worker who had interacted with my father regularly. And we kept page 9 for the right moment. Meanwhile, Tyler was getting confident. He started acting like the outcome was already settled. I heard from a cousin that he had told people he expected the case to resolve quickly. He showed up to preliminary hearings polished and relaxed. His lawyer spoke with authority about my supposed manipulation. Family members who had been on the fence began visibly moving toward his side, expecting me to fall apart or settle. I didn't fall apart. I got quieter. I know people read that as weakness. I've spent my whole life watching people mistake my stillness for surrender. I let them. Gerald reminded me of something during one of our last preparation sessions. He said, "Let them talk. Truth doesn't rush." I wrote that down. I kept it with me. The morning of the main hearing, I woke up early, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I thought about my father. I thought about the Tuesday morning in October when he died and I was holding his hand. I thought about what he had written in his own words, in his careful handwriting, because he had known something like this might happen. He had known Tyler. He had loved Tyler. But he had also known exactly what the truth was. I was not afraid when I walked into that courtroom. I was tired. I was sad in the deep way that doesn't go away quickly, but I was not afraid. Tyler's lawyer opened with confidence. He laid out the claim clearly and rehearsed, painting a picture of a vulnerable man in his final months, surrounded by a daughter who had isolated him and steered his decisions. He used the text messages. He referenced family members who had submitted written statements supporting Tyler's version. He spoke about fairness and about how a man of my father's character would naturally have wanted an equal distribution. Tyler himself spoke briefly and performed grief very well. He talked about missing his father. He talked about how hard it had been to watch from a distance. He said, "I just want what my father actually intended." His voice broke slightly on the last word. A few people in the gallery shifted sympathetically. I sat still. My father's doctor had submitted a statement confirming that he had been fully cognitively capable throughout the period the will was updated. The social worker had confirmed the same. Gerald walked through the caregiver documentation methodically. Dates, times, records. He presented the voice recordings with proper legal context. My father's voice filled that room, clear, calm, talking about his wishes. I watched Tyler's lawyer's face during that part. The composure didn't break, but something behind his eyes changed. Then Gerald submitted the full will document for the judge's review. The judge read through it, page by page. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning. He stopped. He turned back a page. He read something again. He looked up briefly, then looked back down. He turned to page 9. He read it slowly. I watched his face. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Just the specific change that happens when a person reads something honest and undeniable. He looked at Tyler's lawyer. Then he looked at Tyler. Then he said, "I'd like to read a portion of this aloud." The room waited. Page 9 was a signed, notarized personal statement written entirely by my father, dated 7 months before his death. In it, he explained his decision clearly and completely. He described the years of my caregiving in specific detail. He named dates. He described Tyler's absence without cruelty, but without softening the truth either. He wrote that his decision about the inheritance was not made out of sentiment or pressure. It was made out of accuracy. He had seen who showed up. He had seen who stayed. He had made a choice that reflected what was real. He also included a paragraph that addressed the possibility of a dispute. He wrote that if anyone contested his wishes after his passing, they should understand that he had written this statement of his own will, in sound mind, with full knowledge of what he was doing, and that any claim of outside influence would be false. He had signed it. Gerald had witnessed it. A notary had certified it. The judge read all of it. When he finished, the room was completely still. I mean that in a way that felt physical, like the air itself had stopped moving. Tyler sat very straight in his chair and did not look at me. His lawyer was writing something rapidly on a notepad. I don't know what. I don't think it mattered. The judge set the document down. He looked at both sides. Then he said what he needed to say, and it was over. My father's will was upheld. The inheritance was distributed as written. The contest was dismissed. I didn't cry in the courtroom. I had used up most of my tears in the months before. What I felt in that moment was something quieter. Something that felt less like victory and more like finally exhaling after holding your breath for too long. Tyler left without speaking to me. I heard later that he told someone in the family that the whole thing had been rigged. I wasn't surprised. Some people can only explain losing by blaming the process. A few relatives reached out in the weeks after. Some apologized carefully and vaguely. Others just sent messages asking how I was doing as if none of it had happened. I was polite. I was brief. I kept my distance. I wasn't angry in a way that needed to be expressed. I just understood something clearly now that I had only suspected before. I knew who these people were. I knew what they had shown me when things got hard. That information was valuable. I would keep it. I used the inheritance the way I had always planned to use any money that came to me, carefully and with intention. I paid off debts. I started building the kind of stability I had always worked toward but never quite reached. I began looking into something I had wanted to do for years, a small business of my own, something that was mine entirely. I wasn't doing it to prove anything to anyone. I was doing it because I had earned the right to build something peaceful. The last thing I want to say is this. They saw my silence my entire life and they thought it was nothing. They saw me stay and they thought it was weakness. They saw me keep records and they never asked why. They made a story about who I was and they were so certain they were right that they walked into a courtroom with it. And my father, from page 9 of a document they never bothered to read carefully enough, told the truth for both of us. They only saw my silence. They never understood my strength. If someone has ever tried to take what was rightfully yours, not just money, but your effort, your time, your years, your truth, I want you to know that you are not alone. The people who stay quiet and do the work and keep the records are not weak. They are building something that holds. And when the moment comes, when the judge pauses on page 9 and reads it aloud to a silent room, it holds. Leave a comment below if you've ever had someone try to rewrite your story. I read every single one. If you want to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing. This channel exists for people who have been underestimated, overlooked, and pushed aside, and who stayed standing anyway. And if this story reached something in you, click hype and help it reach someone else who needs to hear it. Stories like this aren't just about winning a legal case. They're about finally being seen. For every person who has stayed quiet while others talked over them, who has worked hard while others took credit, who has loved people who didn't love them back with the same consistency, this story is yours. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, even when it takes a while, even when the room is loud and everyone seems to be on the other side. Subscribe if you want to be part of a community that believes in showing up, doing the work, and standing firm even when it's inconvenient. You don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to perform your pain to have it matter. You just have to keep going. And you never know who needs to hear that today.